network, binational network that is committed to really focusing on what the governments have committed to do in the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreements. We work binationally and really, focusing on things like virtual elimination, zero discharge, making sure that the proper chemicals of concern are getting listed into the agreement and developing strategy plans for those, and that others that need to be designated, such as radionuclides and sulfates, for example, are moving towards designation. At least we make valiant efforts on that in cooperation with groups throughout the basin who are participating with us in that work. The other co-chair of the network is Mike Murray from the National Wildlife Federation, and also Faye De Leon of the Canadian Environmental Law Association does a huge amount of work for this group. What I want to do first is quickly describe to you our purpose today, and then we'll get into the presentation. As a result of input that we've received from many of you and from other people that we talk with on both sides of the border throughout the Great Lakes, we're really wanting to develop a strategy to address toxics in products that are in use in the Great Lakes Basin. What is the effect of those toxics and eventually getting out into the environment? And in particular, we've been taking a focus on endocrine disrupting substances, but other ones as well, and you'll hear more about that. This is the second of a series of 2 webinars, and the first one that we held, I guess about 2 weeks ago now, no, actually a week and a half ago, was with Mike Gilbertson, who's a scientist who's worked a lot on toxics over the decades and used to be with the International Joint Commission and Environment Canada on these issues, and Meg Sears, who's heavily involved in these issues again. And what they talked about in theirs was endocrine disrupting chemicals, the sort of effects that they have on people and on the environment, their presence in the Great Lakes, and their nature. They also gave us a really important historical perspective on addressing chemicals in the Great Lakes Basin, the history of addressing them, and particularly under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. And they had a real focus on the role that the scientists have played in that and the role that the environmental groups have played in that. So it was an extremely valuable webinar. This one, the second in the series, and if you want access to that webinar, it is in the notice that was sent out to you by Faye, a link to see that webinar. The second one today is to really focus in on what are the types of approaches that we can take to address the sorts of problems that were brought up in the last webinar, and with the objective of ultimately getting to the situation of developing some campaigns that we can work on and launch. And we'll talk about that again at the end of the session. So before we get on to the presentation, I want to turn it over to Anna to just quickly describe the process we're going through in terms of your getting to speak later in the session. Anna? Are you there, Anna? Anna, are you sure you're not on mute?
I believe that Anna was having some issues with her phone, so I don't believe she's connected right now.
So why don't I start? This is Faye De Leon from CEPA. And there's a slide that's been put up, which Anna would have spoken to. And generally is if you have any questions that you want to ask based on the presentation, you can either click onto the chat box, which is the, by clicking at the bottom, you'll find the icons at the bottom. You can type in your chat, and we will read them off during the question and answer period. And as well, we will also open it up to those who you want to raise a question verbally by putting up your hand in the same chat box. So I think that's basically the format that Anna wanted to share with folks as we start the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Faye. So we're going to first have a presentation for about 35 minutes, and we'll have everybody on mute during that because it's hard to, we get feedback and all sorts of odd things. So that's why you'll be on mute until that point. So we'll turn it over to Beverley Thorpe. Bev has researched and promoted clean production strategies internationally for more than 30 years and was the first clean production technical expert for Greenpeace International on chemical and waste issues. During her time at Greenpeace in Europe, she coordinated the PVC and chlorine campaigns and worked to popularize the emerging issue of endocrine disrupting chemicals. She is a co-founder and current program director at Clean Production Action, a US-based NGO that promotes strategic solutions for safer chemicals economy. Bev is an annual lecturer on chemicals policy and corporate practices at Lund University in Sweden, which I'm sure many of you have heard of, and they do an amazing amount of stuff on chemicals policy and extended producer responsibility. And we are very pleased to say that she lives in Toronto, so we have easy and quick access to her. So Bev, I don't see your slides showing on my screen yet. Was the transfer made?
Anna just needs to stop sharing the screen so I can share my computer.
Bev or Ashman, are you able to overcome that? Take it over?
Just one moment.
Here it comes, great. So thanks, Bev, go ahead.
Yes, I'd like to share my screen. So if you could just stop sharing, I'll show my screen and go through my slides.
Able to now, Bev.
Okay, we have liftoff. Good. Share screen. Here we go. All right. These things always work in the end. All right. It's a great pleasure, and I'm totally delighted to be invited to speak about various approaches to reduce and eliminate toxic chemicals. And there is a fair bit to cover, so I'm just going to dive right in the interest of time. So I'm going to lay out the next 35 minutes briefly with a problem statement, a brief introduction to why there is increasing focus on chemicals and products. And if people could mute in the background, that would be great. Thank you. And then focus on PFAS and flame retardant chemicals throughout this talk, using the examples. And then I'm going to use something called the BIZNGO Principles for Safer Chemicals as a framing to describe the different drivers and tools that exist and are helping to move to implement these principles, with a focus on regulation, NGOs, retailers, different tools and strategies, and finally, the investment community. And then I'll finish with a few concluding statements and observations and move it over to questions. So why chemicals and products? Well, hazardous chemicals are leaching into our surrounding environment, particularly our indoor environment, and particularly into house dust. Lots of studies have been carried on looking at the amount of hazardous chemicals in our house dust. The report you see at the bottom right of your screen is a study we did in 2005 with groups in the US, where we found chemicals of high concern in all the vacuum bag dust we analyzed from 70 homes across 70 states, including the pesticide DDT, a pesticide that was banned over 40 years ago, yet is still prevalent in house dust. And this is confirmed by a 2016 review of a compilation of all dust studies which show the presence of chemicals, particularly phthalates, phenols, flame retardants, fragrances, and the perfluoroalkyls, all of which have endocrine disrupting effects. This slide, which I've just borrowed from last week's slide from Michael Gilbertson and Meg Sears, reinforces the presence of these and other chemicals of concern in the Great Lakes Basin. And I know Michael's message here was that we have been facing a big regulatory failure, particularly around these emerging chemicals. So if we look at perfluorinated, the PFAS chemicals and the brominated flame retardants, where are the per and perfluoroalkyl substances found, commonly known as PFAS? Well, because of their stain, grease, and water repellent properties, they're found in a whole range of products which you and I use. Our carpets, our carpet cleaning products, our furnishings, protective coatings that you spray on shoes, as well as the outdoor gear and outdoor clothing industry because of their water repellency. They're also found in cosmetics and, of course, the nonstick food pans that we buy, and also in firefighting foam. And the problem with the PFAS group of chemicals is that they're totally ubiquitous. 98%, some of the studies are showing, this is a slide I've taken from Green Science Policy Institute, 98% of us have body burdens of these chemicals and linked to a whole range of impacts such as their probable carcinogens, elevated cholesterol, obesity, immune suppression, as well as endocrine disruption. These are the types of health impacts that we're seeing on the rise globally. Then we have the brominated and chlorinated flame retardants, again in common products because of the flame retardancy. They have to, they have been used to meet standards. And again, here's the furnishings and the carpets, the polyurethane foam, the wire and cable, and of course electronics. And these also are now global pollutants, and many of which have long known to be endocrine disruptors, also found in house dust. And this is just the slide, again, I took from Green Science Policy. It outlines some of the well-known impacts from Penta, which was the first chemical in this class to come under scrutiny. And what is quite telling is that the effects on children mirror many of the effects we saw with PCB contamination with children because of the similar structural molecular makeup. Thyroid disruption being a big issue with endocrine disrupting impacts. So I went through that quite quickly because what I want to get to really is the essence of this talk, which is chemicals. Why are we so fixated on chemicals? Well, first of all, chemicals are also increasingly becoming a business risk, which is why there's a lot of demand and focus on the need for transparency. Downstream users of chemicals, in other words, brands and retailers, face particular business and reputational risk from the use of hazardous chemicals because they're also under pressure from consumers and investors to know and disclose the use of hazardous chemicals. We also hear a lot of the need for the circular economy, but of course we cannot be recirculating hazardous chemicals, creating ongoing exposure to humans and wildlife if we want to achieve a sustainable future. And that is why we need green chemistry, clean production, and the safe recycling and reuse of materials in our economic systems and in our whole environment. This whole approach on chemicals in products is a big focus now of the United Nations SciCam program. And the reason why they're focusing on chemicals in products is because, as they point out, international trade is increasing chemical exposure through global product chains. And what they're doing to tackle this, again, is to ensure vital information is shared about chemical substances across the entire product life cycle in order for designers and brands and suppliers and waste handlers, NGOs, consumers to know what they're handling when they're handling products. And they're focusing on a product sector approach with specific emphasis on electronics, toys, building products, and textiles. So to look at various approaches to reduce hazardous chemicals, I thought it would be useful to frame these examples by using the BIZNGO Principles for Safer Chemicals. The principles were drawn up by the BIZNGO Working Group for Safer Chemicals, which is a project of Clean Production Action. And BIZNGO is a really unique collaboration of environmental NGO and business leaders who work to identify the challenges and opportunities to advance a safer chemicals economy. These principles were compiled in 2008, and they feature 4 key aspects, which you can read in more detail at the link below. But to summarize, the first principle is, number 1, to know and disclose product chemistry. This means manufacturers will identify the chemicals used in a product across its life cycle and will increase public disclosure of chemicals, particularly chemicals of high concern. Buyers will request product chemistry data from their suppliers. The second principle is to assess and avoid hazards. Again, manufacturers will determine the hazard characteristics of the chemicals they use and then prioritize chemicals of high concern for elimination, and then redesign with inherently safer alternatives. Number 3 is to commit to continuous improvement, using a framework for the regular review of product and process chemistry with the goal of continuous adoption of substitutes with inherently lower hazard potential. And then number 4 is to support public policies and industry standards. Here, stakeholders actively support policy initiatives that will advance the implementation of the above 3 principles, including support for green chemistry research and education. And you can read how businesses are implementing these principles in the Guide to Safer Chemicals, which I featured here with the link below. So here are 5 examples of some of the drivers and tools I want to focus on over the next few minutes to advance safer chemicals. Let's start with the role of regulation. Regulations as a push. The Center for International Environmental Law published a great report in 2013 entitled Driving Innovation: How Stronger Laws Help Bring Safer Chemicals to Market. And what they point out is that regulations that restrict hazardous chemicals do drive research and development in alternatives and hopefully in safer alternatives. For instance, they point to the REACH and new ROS restrictions on phthalates, which increase the production of non-phthalate alternatives. REACH is the European Chemicals Regulation, and the ROS Directive is the restriction on hazardous substances in the electronic sector. Once the new ROS law came into effect, which listed 4 phthalates as part of the restriction, there was a spike in the patenting of phthalate alternatives, clearly correlating with the timing of this new legislation. However, they also cautioned that regrettable substitution could appear in substitutes unless policy also requires the transparent screening of alternatives. Here's a slide I like to use showing that company leaders, in this case Apple, Sony, and HP, lobbied for the elimination of bromine and PVC in the revised ROS directive back in 2010. They actively went to meetings in Brussels. And as Max Sharp from Sony Ericsson said, the transition is already happening within the industry, and when volumes go up, it will be cheaper for companies to buy BFR-free components than to buy components relying on bromine and flame retardants. And further legislation can continue to drive this innovation in the right direction. I've also, in addition, I put in a small statement here on the slide noting that the CPSC, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission, has recommended the phase out not only of BFRs, brominated flame retardants, but of all organohalogen flame retardants, demonstrating how markets can shift away from whole classes of hazardous chemicals. So this is a nice example of meeting the principles of safer chemicals regarding supporting public policies and assessing and avoiding hazardous chemicals. The Washington State report, the Washington State's Children's Safe Products Reporting Rule is a really nice example of pushing disclosure. The rule currently contains about 85 chemicals of high concern, which manufacturers must report annually on the presence and use of these chemicals in children's products offered for sale in Washington. Well, you can imagine that for many brands and companies, this might be the first time they have done a deep dive into their chemical use. The fact they have to report the presence of any of these specified chemicals is a business risk because the reports are public. And here, California in February proposed to list carpets with any PFAS as priority products for regulation. I'm hearing through grapevines that the institutional carpet manufacturers are moving to PFAS-free options, while the residential market for carpets is slower to respond to this this initiative. Here's a slide which I think is a really valuable resource. This is a map of the U.S. state-based chemicals policy initiatives put up by Safer State, which is a collaboration of NGOs in the U.S. And the great thing about this resource is that you can click on each of these states and see the impending legislation and the past rulings and legislation that have occurred around different issues. Regarding the Great Lakes ecosystem, you can click on all the Great Lakes states and look at what is coming down the pike regarding legislation on PFAS, flame retardant chemicals, and more. And I also think it's useful to compare what's happening at the Canadian federal and provincial level regarding comparable legislation. So do check out this great resource. One of the reasons why there's a lot of concern around chemicals in the Great Lakes, particularly what's called emerging chemicals like PFAS, is that there's a large growing contamination of water systems with detectable PFOA. The US EPA has estimated something like 1% contamination rate, but from this slide, which I took from Green Science Policy Institute, they point out that some testing labs are showing up to 24% contamination. So again, you can see the impact around the Great Lakes area of these chemicals. Here's another great initiative from Washington State. They recently signed in March this year the Healthy Food Packaging Act, which again would ban paper food packaging containing any PFAS chemicals. A really good example of pushing the principle of assessing and avoiding within the market. And the reason why food packaging has come under scrutiny from this slide, again, which I took from Arlene Bloom's group at Green Science Policy, is that fluorine in US fast food packaging paper is endemic if you look at the percentages associated with dessert and bread wrappings, sandwich and burger wrappings, and paperboard. Again, because the function of these PFAS chemicals is that they do allow grease proofing, which sounds great as a function, but isn't so great when you realize that some of the biggest exposure routes of PFAS chemicals is through inhalation and ingestion. And again, back to Washington State, they recently passed a ban on PFAS in firefighting foam. Recently, that they would ban the sale of PFAS-containing foam or any foam with fluorine beginning July 1st, 2020, and also requiring notification regarding the presence of PFAS chemicals in firefighting gear, because firefighters not only are exposed to a lot of toxic chemicals from the smoke itself and from fires themselves, but also you don't want to be fighting fires with PFAS impregnated chemicals in your suits. So again, this is a great example of assessing and avoiding hazards, knowing and disclosing the presence of hazardous chemicals in products. And then finally, just on the legislative with a nod to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, I had a quick look, but it only seems as though CEPA is currently addressing long-chain PFAS, and even so with exemptions. And there seems to be no strategy to avoid regrettable substitutions. It's notable that the Fluoro Council is pushing short-chain fluorine chemistry as substitutes. And they note that a project with Environment and Health Canada successfully showed the reduction of long-chain PFAS. However, as scientists have stated, the evidence of short-chain PFAS chemicals is increasing in water bodies, and indeed they are persistent. And there's now a new focus on the breakdown products of these short-chain perfluorinated chemicals. So really a class-based approach is essential, particularly considering there are non-PFAS alternatives available. All right, let's look at NGOs as a big push factor. Looking at brominated flame retardants this time, the groups that were actively and have been actively working on brominated flame retardants for many years realized that one of the biggest challenges and biggest barriers to the move to safer products was the flammability standard. So there was a great coalition that worked very effectively to change the flammability standard from an open flame source to a smoldering flammability standard. And this allowed products to meet the standard without added flame retardant chemicals, which have been linked to cancer, hormone disruption, reduced IQ, reproductive, neurological impairments. The list goes on. Why are we putting chemicals with this profile in products? So the new standard, TB 117 2013, has this great disclosure. Here you can see the actual label, which I encourage everyone to check before you start buying furniture. Make sure that it meets the TB 113 2013 standard. And again, what the groups are doing is to really move the market by highlighting the suppliers of flame retardant free furniture. In this case, the Green Science Policy Institute lists all the different suppliers of foam without added flame retardants, so that if you wanted to switch out the foam in your furniture and look for a flame retardant free substitute, here's where you could find them. And similarly, the Center for Environmental Health continues to put out great report cards for consumers to identify flame retardant free products, not just for residential, but for office furniture. Similarly, on PFAS, Greenpeace led a very, I would say, successful campaign to highlight the use of PFAS chemicals in the outdoor clothing sector. In fact, they even headed up to the Arctic and wore PFAS-free outer gear just to demonstrate that you could meet the functionality without these hazardous chemicals. And because they're global pollutants, this became a big international campaign. The result is, if you check out the report at the bottom, the PFC revolution in the outdoor sector, this shows the brands. They did a lot of company rankings, the brands which have now made public commitments about their policies on PFAS chemicals, their plans to eliminate if they haven't already done so, and the timelines by which they will do so. This campaign achieved success not only through company rankings, but through social mobilization, pressuring specifically the brands to adopt non-PFAS design, and of course, always underlined by public disclosure of their chemical policy. And I just did a little snapshot here of Gore, the company that makes the Gore-Tex, with how they're going to move forward on eliminating hazardous PFAS chemicals of what they call environmental concern, the percentage by which they'll do so, and the timeline by which they will achieve this. By having a very clear public disclosure of chemical policies, of course, it allows the public to track progress. So just to conclude, there really is a very vibrant, coordinated U.S. network currently working on PFAS in the U.S., and these NGOs are working with purchasers and firefighters and retailers and legislators, city officials, and other key stakeholders to promote non-PFAS alternatives in specific product sectors, the food contact materials, firefighting foams, textiles and carpets, and of course all the time promoting legislation that will lead to a phase out of the entire class. So moving right along, let's look at retailers as drivers, and I call this a pull driver. Just checking the time here, how are we doing? Okay, so I'm using the example of Walmart simply because it's such a big player in the global market. Walmart has now very readable, if you go on to the link I've supplied below, sustainable chemistry policy and very clear implementation guides for their suppliers on what they're hoping to achieve with their new chemicals policy. And this has gone beyond their original 8 chemicals of high concern, which they announced. And the way Walmart's moving forward on this is basically through transparency. There, as I've taken this from their report here, we ask all our Walmart US and Sam's Club US stores, national and private brands, to 1, disclose full product formulations to the Works. The Works is a third-party database which suppliers to Walmart, who are supplying what they call consumables. These are chemical intensive products, the cleaning products, the beauty personal care products, things which have direct application to skin as a priority, of course. Walmart calls them consumables. So if you're a supplier of any of these products, you have to disclose your full chemical ingredient by CAS number to the Works database. Walmart does not see the chemical ingredients, but what the Works does is it filters, and any product that contains one of the 8 high priority chemicals is dinged. And in fact, I believe that the supplier then gets an email directly saying that you use one of these 8 high priority chemicals. It also allows Walmart buyers to have a dialogue with suppliers. Again, they're not seeing the chemical formulations, but they're being alerted that these products are containing chemicals of concern that Walmart has designated. The second thing is that Walmart is asking product suppliers to put their product ingredients online by product brand. Secondly, to disclose all Walmart priority chemicals or all product ingredients on pack. And then they're trying to encourage this internationally, keeping in mind that their scope actually is the US, but with a nod to the fact that they are global, they, quote, encourage online and on-pack disclosure internationally. And then Walmart says they will measure the percentage of suppliers' products with online and on-pack ingredient disclosure. I should point out that the 8 high priority chemicals are, some of them you may know or be familiar with. One is toluene. They've listed a couple of phthalates. Nonylphenol ethoxylates is another one. Formaldehyde, a couple of parabens, and then triclosan. The antimicrobial is also part of what they call their high priority chemicals. And then measuring progress, they, in analyzing the data, as shown here, Walmart was able to identify that a small number of suppliers use the largest volumes of all Walmart high priority chemicals. Those are those 8 I just mentioned, with one supplier in particular using the majority of high priority chemicals in only a few select products. And as Walmart states, we have encouraged these suppliers to reformulate their products to remove the high priority and priority chemicals, and then admit that while we have removed 96% of these chemicals by weight, there is still a long way to go before removing all HPCs. And we will continue to actively encourage suppliers to advance safer formulations. The metrics below capture the reduction of high priority chemicals by weight, volume, the restriction and elimination of high priority chemicals by number of UPCs, that's the universal product codes or the barcodes that you see on products, and the number of suppliers. So again, just to show the impact of transparency and the way that Walmart will continue to measure progress over time. And then just to end off with Walmart, first of all, to acknowledge that the beauty and personal care product sector really is a primary focus with a lot of leading retailers and brands. We're seeing a lot of new collaborations within the sector, comparing restricted substances list and really putting pressure on suppliers and screening, hazard assessments, etc. Walmart, of course, jumped up ahead in publicity and announced that they were going to reduce the chemical footprint of their consumables for their Walmart and Sam's Club's US stores by 10% by 2022, therefore becoming the first US retailer to set a time-bound reduction. And it's not just retailers that are moving forward on disclosure. You're seeing brands like SC Johnson, a lot of NGOs, including Women's Voices for the Earth, did really effective campaigns to push for full ingredient disclosure. And there you can read more about the brand's chemicals policy. So again, every time I go through some of these slides, just check out the principle that I've been highlighting. In this case, it's knowing and disclosing. A great tactic. So moving to tools and strategic frameworks as another driver for moving brands and retailers to safer chemicals. I wanted to just do a very quick summary overview of the GreenScreen for safer chemicals, simply because it now is a globally recognized chemical hazard assessment tool. CPA designed this with a big scientific and international advisory board to promote the chemical identification, the hazard identification of chemicals, and also provide a roadmap to green chemistry through 4 benchmarks. It's scientifically rigorous, and we had the value as an NGO to make sure the method was open source and transparent, so you can go to the GreenScreen website and just download the whole methodology for free. Here are the 4 benchmarks, which basically have categorize the universe of chemicals into 4 benchmarks. The benchmark 1 is the whole criteria of chemicals that have high hazard, chemicals of high concern, and we use the not just the European REACH criteria for substances of very high concern, but also international precedent. And then benchmark 2 proceeds to less hazard, moving on to 3 and 4. The 18 hazard endpoints show the rigor by which chemicals are assessed. So for each of these human health and environmental endpoints or categories, a chemical will be assessed. So to what level of hazard is it? Is it a carcinogen? To what level or hazard does it cause reproductive problems? To what level is it an endocrine active chemical? Oh, I'm getting feedback. Can someone please mute their phone? And then you can also see environmental toxicity and fate. So to what level does it pose itself as an acute or a chronic aquatic toxicity, et cetera, et cetera. How persistent is it? How bioaccumulative is it? And then we also put in physical hazards with particularly thinking of workers, how reactive and flammable is that chemical? So after each chemical is assessed for each of these endpoints rigorously, the nice thing is you end up with a very nice, clear hazard summary table. And this slide shows the hazard summary table for triclosan, which under the benchmark is a benchmark 1 chemical under GreenScreen assessment. And then you can see here the level of hazard. It might not be high as a carcinogen, but you can see it's very high for acute toxicity. And notice here in particular under ecotox, it's very high for acute and chronic aquatic toxicity, which is very important to know, considering that a lot of triclosan is put into products that end up being washed down the drain. So you really don't want to be putting this chemical in soaps and cosmetics or cleaning materials or anything that you know is going to go down the drain. It's a nice way to make informed decisions, as well as the fact it's a benchmark 1 chemical. You don't want to be using it. And we use the GreenScreen assessments in a report that CPA did with CELA to highlight the problems of triclosan and triclocarbon in the Great Lakes ecosystem a few years ago. One last thing I'll say is that a lot of people say, well, we can't get disclosure from suppliers. They don't want to give us their chemical ingredient formulations. The nice thing about putting it through a GreenScreen hazard summary table is that you can redact the CAS number. You can keep that more or less confidential, but what you can still ask for is this full hazard summary table. That's really what you want to know about a chemical.
Bev, 5 minutes left.
Okay, I'm almost on time. All right.
Yep.
Okay, so who uses GreenScreen? Apple has been using GreenScreen for a long time, and recently they have showcased in their 2018 supplier responsibility report that they found benchmark 1 and benchmark 2 chemicals in their cleaners and degreasers that they have completely replaced with safer alternatives. So again, a nice way of assessing, avoiding, committing to continuous improvement, and being very public about disclosing your chemical policy. And 2 slides I thought worth using here on Hewlett-Packard. Was the first corporation to use GreenScreen back in 2007. And they realized that this was a way to help them avoid regrettable substitutions. So in their procurement specifications, they have put GreenScreen as one of their criteria. And as they say, a corporation doesn't want to keep moving from one material to another. It's just too expensive. And you want to make sure that you're ahead of the game and avoid restrictions of new regulatory restrictions in the future. So now they've added it to a whole range of products. And one last thing, I'll leave you on the other reason why I think GreenScreen's had a big uptake is that the process engineers really like the clarity of the benchmarks. So when HP says, we want you to reformulate out of PVC and brominated flame retardants, but we want to make sure we're not moving into something as hazardous, you have to use benchmark 2 or higher chemical ingredients. Process engineers love the fact they can just do an analysis, identify the chemicals in the formula that are benchmark 1, and then get to work redesigning that out with benchmark 2 or higher. So it's a nice pragmatic tool. Finally, investors. These are becoming a big pull on moving the economy to safer chemicals. And what some investors are now saying is that chemicals are the new carbon. So the Chemical Footprint Project was launched in 2014 by CEPA, and the whole goal was to transform corporate chemicals management. But more importantly, similar to carbon footprinting, the project allows companies now to have a clear metric for measuring their chemical footprint and then setting goals to reduce it. And you measure your chemical footprint by measuring the weight or looking at the percentage of specified chemicals of high concern in your product or your facilities or your manufacturing processes. It's a way to start looking at the use of chemicals of high concern and setting goals to reduce it. This has attracted a lot of interest from investors who are increasingly scoring companies on their business risk from their use of hazardous chemicals. And investors are now encouraging companies in their portfolio to take the 20-question survey and report on progress. So I put in some stats about, we now have institutional purchasers with over 70 billion in purchasing power that are pushing their companies in their portfolios to take the chemical footprint survey. And the slide here is that Gojo, a company you might not know, but you'll certainly know its brand Purell. They were the first one to make the public commitment to cut their chemical footprint in half by 2020. So again, a really nice highlighting the principles of assessing and avoiding and committing to continuous improvement. So the last slide are conclusions. I have 4 conclusions I thought would be worth mentioning. One is that, first of all, with new tools and strategies, companies can and are reducing their chemical footprint. Company leaders, in fact, in specific product sectors, are sharing best practice, restricted substances lists. They're pressuring for full materials disclosure from their suppliers, and this is creating innovation in their supply chain. The second is disclosure, really important. First of all, it's disclosure that is making brands and retailers really start to scrutinize the types of chemicals they have in their products. And now I think it's important that they also make sure that their chemicals policy is public and that they're outlining their roadmap to safer chemicals adoption. In fact, company leaders really understand the value of doing this. Legislation, the key criteria, I think, whenever you see legislation on the books or proposed legislation is it going to advance the principles of safer chemicals? Is it going to promote know and disclose, assess and avoid, commit to continuous improvement? And is it addressing product sectors? Is it setting clear timelines for hazardous chemical phase out? Or is it obstructing this move to innovation in safe alternatives? Is it simply holding on to the bad status quo? And then finally, The coordinated and product sector-based NGO campaigns are demonstrating quicker success in moving markets to safer materials than a chemical by chemical approach. Dialogue with downstream chemical users is essential because it is these downstream users of chemicals who face the biggest business risk and reputational risk. And in fact, our BIZNGO working group demonstrates the value of bringing stakeholders under the same tent with a common mission. And then finally, it is important to promote the use of strategies and tools that can help move retailers and brands to safer chemicals adoption. And frankly, it would be great to have even more investors ask companies to join the Chemical Footprint Project and learn how to reduce their chemical footprint. With that, I know we're moving into a Q&A. However, I would just like to take one moment to say that some of you on this webinar may have known or worked with Andy Egregious. And even if you didn't know Andy, we have him to thank for so much excellent work to move our economy to safer chemicals. Andy passed away recently at the very young age of 48 from brain cancer. He was the founder of Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and as colleagues point out, was the mastermind behind the social movement that has swept BPA from store shelves and led to state and national bans on toxic chemicals. Andy joined us at many a BIZNGO annual meeting and provided us with years of strategic advice on chemicals policy reform. And I just have to say, we will miss him all greatly.